Now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote for this year's symposium event, Lauren Sanchez. Lauren asked us to keep her introduction short, so Lauren, I will, but I do want to just mention a few things. Last fall, Lauren was appointed by Governor Newsom as Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy and Intergovernmental Relations at Cal EPA. She's held so many roles prior to that at the California Air Resources Board as International Policy Director, the US Department of State, where she served as a climate negotiator on the Paris Agreement under President Obama. She was an advisor for the UN, a research project leader at Yale, a Moran Fellow at the National Resource Defense Council. Wow. I mean, Lauren, you have such a pedigree, you have such a wealth of experience, but most important, you have a lot of insight to share with us. So Lauren currently resides in Oakland with her husband, spends most of her weekends exploring the wilderness of California. But Lauren, we are so honored to have you with us today. When you're ready, please begin sharing your video and audio, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you for being with us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve. How's the audio and video? Good. Sweet. Well, first off, thanks so much to Steve and SCI for the invitation. I'm honored to be here today. I have to say, this is probably the thing I was most looking forward to joining in recent weeks. Just catching the end of the panel, what I felt from the amazing panelists were notions of hope and of growth and of motivation. And I have to say, working at the state government in a time like this moment in time we find ourselves in is, lacking in those areas. So thank you so much for having me, and congratulations. I mean, what an accomplishment to everyone on the line, to the Climate Corps, a decade of really, really important work. So really thrilled to be here. I wanted to kind of anchor my remarks in this moment in time. One of the things I had talked about with Steve and preparing to join you all today was, the tone of a keynote, I think, could change based on the headlines of any given day. And it's something I really want us all to reflect on. And then I'm happy to share a little bit about my path and experience to this overly fancy title, and then how we kind of move forward together. And definitely want to leave time for a couple questions at the end, because you all are the brains, and really, really excited to be here and hear from you as well. So I think I'd maybe start by a nod to, the crisis that we're all facing, noting that this gathering virtual is an amazing adaptation. And I love that someone noted that it's kind of easier to virtually organize, or rather there are kind of benefits. And, my niece is graduating from 8th grade today, and my baby sister graduated from college, and I have seen an amazing amount of resolve in our communities and our graduating classes and teachers in school rooms, and colleagues in government, but really want to acknowledge just how difficult these times are for all of us. And in that same note, I think we are seeing the resilience of a lot of our communities in dealing with the health crisis and the pandemic, and more recently, an amazing uprising surrounded around the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of these questions of racial justice. And for me, having worked on climate for the past decade, there are so many intersections between the pandemic and the health crisis and the injustice that we are trying to confront every moment of every day, that I am so honored to be joined by all of you in this field, and really, really excited about, the opportunities that the next weeks and months and years and decades present to all of us to really re-envision what our society looks like. As we know, a lot of our communities right now are mobilized around protecting public health. My role at Cal EPA, as mentioned, is around protecting public health and the environment. We know that after this crisis, the next big one is climate. Given kind of projections of our snowpack over the winter, and for those of you that have resided in California over recent years know that wildfire season is right around the corner. So as I think about kind of building community resilience to the health crisis, I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn as we kind of try to tackle the climate crisis as well. But how did I get here? Thanks for the shortened bio, Steve. I like to kind of mention in talking about my path, I think one of the most important things you can bring to any career or position is passion and heart. I grew up in Seattle. The photo behind me is actually from the Sierra here in California, but I grew up in Seattle and spent a lot of time outside and learned early on that you fight hardest to protect what you love. And I loved spending time outside. So by the time I got to college, we were just starting to kind of wrap our heads around what climate change might mean for Mount Rainier and the Cascades and ecosystems like this. And I knew that I was motivated and passionate to do everything I could to stop it. So in undergrad, I studied environmental studies and biology, really with a science lens. Early on, as we now know from all of the kind of anti-science campaigning from our friends in the oil industry, there was a real question for me around how bad was climate change really going to get. And when I reflect back on 2007, which is when I graduated high school, I remember climate change feeling so existential and so long-term. A lot of our modeling was, in 2050, sea level rise will be X, Y, and Z. By 2100, 2 degrees warming. And I think the thing that I have watched over the past decade, and I hope all of you felt during your fellowships, is, the science has accelerated and the problem has accelerated. And in no point early on in my career did I think that we would be breathing hazardous levels of wildfire smoke across California for months of the year. And so really just kind of a feeling of urgency that I have felt over the past decade, but was really grounded in science early on. After leaving college, I went abroad. There's something about climate change that early on I felt was a global problem, and so we needed a global solution and a global lens. For those of you that are thinking about spending time abroad or have, huge period of growth for me in terms of exposure to other types of communities and cultures and ways of thinking. I specifically was in Morocco after feeling like, climate change was going to be kind of the defining issue of our generation, but also 9/11 had a huge impact on worldviews. And I was really determined to kind of counteract everything that any sort of injustice and learn more about the Muslim and Islamic world. Then applied to grad school, which I'd love to talk to any of you individually about. While there, I was on my science track and realized that although climate science is incredibly important, I wanted to be fighting. I wanted to be in the game. I didn't want to be writing about the impacts. I wanted to be stopping them. And at the time for that meant for me policymaking. And so, as Steve mentioned, I joined the UN really under the auspice of global problem, global solution. I happened to join at a time that was really exciting in the international community because everyone was gearing up to sign the world's first global agreement on climate change, the aforementioned Paris Agreement. While at the State Department representing the US government, honed a number of skills that I think I continue to use in my state government hat. I was overwhelmed by the global commitment to tackle this issue. Spent, nights in negotiating rooms until 3 a.m. with US officials and Indian officials and Angolan officials. And it really felt like the entire global community was mobilized around tackling climate change, noting that, there's this massive asymmetry between the actions we take today and the impacts that we are feeling now versus in 10 years. And as we know, the massive inequities that climate change exacerbates around the world. And that I'll mention a little bit later, we also see in California, of course. Signed a global agreement. I joke that it was my career peak. I think I was around 25 at the time. my kind of biggest note would be to you all to take advantage of any opportunity that is placed in front of you. In the case of the State Department, I worked alongside a number of really accomplished lawyers and climate negotiators, and I was new and scrappy and, again, very passionate. And so to the extent to which you are thinking about your next step being a little bit of a risk or a little bit outside of your comfort zone, absolutely do it. That's where you grow. That's where you can add value. That experience shaped the rest of my career. November 2016, when I was still working at the State Department, I think maybe we all remember where we were on the night of the US election. I promise not to make this overly political, but I will just say, the Trump administration coming in definitely sent a number of signals around the world related to all foreign policy issues, especially related to climate change. I spent 6 months working under the Trump administration, stayed at the State Department. We tried to convince the politicals basically to stay in the Paris Agreement. Ultimately, spoiler alert, we're unsuccessful. So I jumped ship and hiked. That's when I took this photo, and did a deep dive on, trying to leave behind a lot of the pessimism and frustration and, sense of doom that I had felt, noting the massive vacuum in kind of federal leadership on this issue. And that has, implications globally, but also a ton domestically across the US. And so at the time, I racked my brain for how to apply these skills and, again, this passion for tackling climate best in a next step. And while at this lake, decided to come work for California. And for those of you that had the opportunity to work for government agencies, you, I think, will appreciate that, leaving federal government, I was excited to stay in government. I think there's a really, really exciting pace to policy making, especially on this issue where urgency is so incredibly important. But I should also mention I had some experience at the nonprofit level, so really happy to help anyone who's kind of deciding across fields. Happy to connect further. In California, my dad grew up in Pasadena, where back in the 70s, where you couldn't see the mountains. And now I live in Oakland, which suffers from wildfire smoke and a variety of other environmental and climate exacerbated issues. I've spent 3 years loving the amount of political support and community support and engagement and thoughtful process that the state takes to a lot of our climate work. We have, the most ambitious climate targets of any major economy. We are the 5th largest economy in the world, but most importantly, I think a lot of our work is really focused on community engagement and public comment, and a lot of grassroots mobilizing, which I think I definitely was not a part of at the federal government. And I think because we're so much closer to communities, I find my work 10 times more rewarding. I think another thing I would like to leave you with today is just connecting to people. So I loved the panelist who spoke about her podcast. Ultimately, because climate is such a cross-cutting, amorphous, complicated issue that affects literally every part of society, it's about helping people connect to issues and helping the scientists communicate to people and the policymakers communicate in a way that makes people feel motivated and a part of this movement and mobilized for change. In terms of kind of moving forward, I am unbelievably honored to be in this fight alongside each of you. It's an all hands on deck exercise, I would say. If I were to have a slide deck, it probably unfortunately would have projections that I'm sure you're all acutely aware of, that don't let any of us sleep well at night. But I will say, again, because climate impacts every aspect of society, and in order to decarbonize our world, we need to be working across sector in an interdisciplinary manner. It's going to take all of us. And what I have enjoyed in California as compared to my former roles is the people of California understand climate change. They prioritize climate change. They vote on climate change. And I think, we get to be kind of the tip of the spear in terms of the national and global conversation. And I think it's an incredibly, incredibly important role to play. And each of the panelists who I saw at the various organizations had a really important role to play. Government can't do it alone. The private sector can't do it alone. Our nonprofits and grassroots organizations can't do it alone. We know that we need each and every one of us. And again, I would just kind of re-emphasize that we need to stay connected to people and communities in what is the fight for our generation. I think you are at this kind of career launching moment. What I was told when I was a little bit younger was, again, to see the beauty and opportunity in every open door. So I think while the massive unemployment numbers and economic devastation and political attention maybe away from green issues right now can feel like a setback, I would challenge each of you to see the opportunity and to see me as a resource as you navigate whatever steps come next. I loved the comment on kind of turning to your supervisors and your networks that you have built over the past year. I think it's incredibly important. I still talk to my first bosses that I had. I think you never really arrive or achieve enlightenment in this field because it's so nascent. There are a number of other professional fields that I think have decades, if not centuries on us. And this one, is kind of in constant evolution. And I think now we are really in the driver's seats of where we want to take this movement. We've seen a lot of action from youth on kind of the global stage. I think in November, we will have really clear direction, at least in the national level. But here in California, we've always prioritized this issue. And I would ask each of you what role, if you want to stay in California, you want to play in driving this agenda forward. We know that we look at climate through an equity lens and through a health lens. We know that economic and fiscal situation is dire, but that is the time for us to be creative and collaborative and to come together. And I guess, again, I would just emphasize how honored I am to be here today with all of you and to be working alongside of you. Please, please, please reach out. There are a number of projects that we need great minds on at the state level, or else I'm happy to be a resource in any other aspect of your career. So thank you again, and happy to take questions.
Lauren, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, you delivered so much more than we could have hoped for. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We do have just a limited time for questions. A reminder, there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for posing questions. If we don't get to your question, we will be working with Lauren to get you responses after this event through email. Lauren,
I love the first question.
Yeah, so I mean, you were just talking about this, Lauren, about the opportunity in light of, a lot of challenges and a lot of downside with the pandemic and coming out of the current situation. So I think this question really is around how might the state, to the extent that you're able to share with us, how might the state take advantage of this moment in time, this opportunity to rethink what is, has been the status quo in terms of how do we reach the state's ambitious goals around carbon neutrality, decarbonization, zero net energy, and what are some of the levers and what are some of the potential ways that we could be looking at rebuilding the workforce, and we can be looking at ramping back up in terms of an economy, but the associated greenhouse gas emissions that go with it. Can you give us any thoughts there?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Liz. What a really great question. It is what I'm spending 95% of my time on these days, and would really welcome a follow-up if the brief answer doesn't cover it. But I think I would think about this in kind of two ways. One is pretty high level and conceptual, and the other is really concrete. So as mentioned, if you saw the New York Times article today, the rebound that we're already seeing globally in terms of emissions and air pollutants is troubling. In California, we've seen a huge plummet, as you can imagine, in GHGs and air pollution, and frankly, demand for gas and diesel we are right now kind of afforded the opportunity, at least from the state government perspective, to think about, as I mentioned earlier, the re-envisioning and the rebuilding and the refashioning. A big part of why our emissions are down. Let me back up. If you look at California's greenhouse gas inventory, half of our greenhouse gas emissions are related to transportation when you include fuel production. And so as the Deputy Secretary on Climate, I spend the vast majority of my time thinking about transportation. And that is how to get people onto mass transit, how to get people to drive less, how to build our communities in a sustainable way that doesn't require cars, electric vehicles, a number of our transportation equity programs, et cetera. And so one of the reasons why our emissions are down, the main driver, right, is everyone's in their homes. How do you then move forward to capture teleworking and address the digital divide in California in a way that allows those individuals that are able to telework to continue teleworking? How do you incentivize government and the private sector to kind of build in a telecommuting lifestyle, which is something the state is definitely thinking about. And luckily we have some federal support in thinking about how the state might build out broadband in our rural communities and our urban communities that right now lack digital access. The other thing I would kind of point to would be a lot of questions around remote learning. There are a number of students who won't go back to school in the fall at the undergrad and graduate level for financial or remote reasons. And one of the questions we're asking ourselves at the state level is, what could those students be doing? What kind of workforce development? What kind of climate corps, for example, where we could offer school credit and training, and similar to FDR era, plant trees, help communities become more resilient, harden critical infrastructure for fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing I'll mention is, we have a $54 billion state deficit. We have a constitutional mandate to balance that. And so we are incredibly reliant right now on relief from our federal partners. But once that relief comes, our intention is to rebuild California in a sustainable, just, and equitable way that advances us towards our climate goals, specifically for my perspective around transportation. But there are a number of opportunities across all of our sectors. We think about resilient infrastructure and what we need to do to the grid ahead of fire season, or natural infrastructure, wetland restoration, fuel and forest health management, healthy soils for our agricultural stakeholders and farm workers in the Central Valley. So I think, we are looking across all of our sectors of greenhouse gas emissions and thinking about, with an influx of federal stimulus dollars, how would we put these to work in a way that creates high quality jobs for Californians and advances all of our climate and equity goals. The governor launched a task force specifically on this topic, and my boss co-chairs the climate subcommittee, which I'm happy to talk to any of you offline. Basically, we are now getting kind of hundreds of proposals, grassroots level, private sector, universities, on kind of bold ideas that are actionable for the governor to take right now, absent federal dollars, or in the case of getting federal dollars, that would really drive us towards a green recovery.
Lauren, thank you. And you anticipated the other two questions in your response, but I'll just call them out. If there's anything else around the collaboration between state government and higher education at this time and in this kind of moment regarding climate mitigation and adaptation. And then the second is just differences, challenges, or potential areas of leverage between federal and state approaches to tackling climate issues.
That second question is a whole dissertation, I have to say. Yeah, I'll try to tackle both of them. So on state and higher ed, to be frank, a lot of California's ambitious climate and clean energy goals are rooted in research from our higher ed that we do in collaboration with a lot of our higher ed institutions around the state. We rely really heavily on the powerhouses that we have and are really lucky to have here in state. that help us shape a lot of our analytical and technical thinking around those goals and then how to implement those goals. I'm happy to send along, if anyone's interested, kind of the latest and greatest in terms of research collaboration that we have been doing. Right now, we're leading a study on how California will achieve its carbon neutrality goal. So by 2045, the state has to be economy-wide carbon neutrality. And we have contracted with 2 different UC schools to look at first, as I mentioned earlier, how we get transportation down to net zero emissions. And then secondly, along kind of that trajectory, how the state should manage the decline of oil and gas production in the state, noting that almost all of our oil produced in state is going into cars. And the vast majority of oil that we're importing is also going into cars. So one kind of concrete example, but happy to follow up with anyone offline. And then biggest differences between federal and state, I would say, wow, I have loved working for both. It's apples and oranges. Working for a state government like California is almost at the scale of the federal government because we are the 5th largest economy in the world. And because of our kind of 50 years of history of working on tackling air pollution and then 20 years on climate, without leaving the technical and going to the political, I would say, here in California, we have more registered independents than Republicans. And the amount of climate forward legislation coming out of the legislature, the amount of political support from all of our voters, and the amount of, I would say, the priority put on environmental justice voices across the state is fundamentally different from the federal level. At the federal level, which is far more moderate, kind of reflecting the national demographics, we were always kind of negotiating against ourselves. And here in California, because we enjoy so much political support, I feel like we have a long runway and we're constantly being pushed, which I really, really appreciate and is such an important part of policymaking. In addition to kind of nationally, the EJ movement being quite a bit different from here in California, I would say if you look at the composition of Congress versus our state legislature, you will see quite a bit difference. I remember my first meeting in the Capitol. I went into a committee hearing and saw people that looked like me on the dais, and that was really the first time I had felt like I was represented in our state legislature, and was incredibly moved by that. And the power that the Hispanic caucus has in Sacramento, which reflects the demographics of California, means that there is a very different political dynamic and elevation for these issues, noting that the majority of those populations live in parts of the state that are really impacted by a lot of these issues. At the federal government, we have the unique kind of legal seat at the UN and a number of international processes. So if you are interested in pursuing and learning more about those, definitely the federal government. I will say here in California, as Steve mentioned, I was International Policy Director at CARB. We have a number of bilateral and multilateral agreements and collaboration with other states and other nations around the world, again, because of our size and our kind of technical expertise on a lot of these issues, but very different role on the global stage, at least legally.
Well, Lauren, thank you. We have some additional very erudite, insightful questions, but unfortunately, we're out of time to field them in this way. But what we are going to do is work with you to pose them and try to just get some brief answers, some answers from you that we can share with the cohort, if that's okay.
Yeah, happy to. And Steve, please do share my contact information because I would love to follow up with anyone who's interested in a conversation.
I certainly will. Lauren, thank you for being with us today. We so appreciate it. You gave a lens on from your view from the bridge at the state, your experience that no one else could have. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you all. Congratulations again.